It looks like, for the time being anyway, the lights are staying out of your glasses, which is great news for me. Roll this one. Everything else is all hunky-dory, so...
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start, and let's start by having you say your name and spell it for us, too, also.
I'm Robert Fletcher, RobertFletcher.
Great, thank you. And my name is Robert Bauman, and today is August 20th of 2013, and this interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. So let's start, if we could, by maybe having you talk about your family and how they came to this area, what brought them here, when they came, that sort of thing.
My folks, my mother and father, grew up in Wisconsin. They knew each other in high school, and my father came out west because my mother had relatives in Idaho, and after she graduated, she came out here to stay with them and go to business college in Spokane. So my dad was fond of her, and he followed her by working his way west. He was an expert milker, and he could always get a job in a dairy, because that when you worked in a dairy milking cows, you had to get up at 3 in the morning, and so when he'd work his way to from Wisconsin to maybe South Dakota, and he would see in the train depot, he would look on the bulletin board for openings for milkers, and he always found work, and he could stay there for several weeks till he got enough money to move on. So he wound up in Lewiston, Idaho, I believe it was, and eventually he and my mother got together, and they got married in Coeur d'Alene, 1912. And I had a sister born in 1915 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Fran Seal, and another sister was born in 1918. In the meantime, during World War I, my dad had been working as in a what you call electrical substation in Coeur d'Alene. And during the war then, he went over to Bremerton and worked in the shipyards at Bremerton, electrical wiring on ships. And my mother and her children, they followed. My mother became a secretary and could do the office work, but after the kids were born, she didn't do much of that. And then after the war was over, Bremerton jobs closed up, and he went back to work at another electric substation down by Walla Walla, Milton Freewater. And he had been raised on a farm, and he had a desire to be independent. And so at that time there were developments in Kennewick and the whole Tri-City area. They were developed because there was irrigation water was being made available from the rivers, and in Richland they were private developers, and they would get bonds that were backed by the state. The state government wanted to support development to get started, and that was in late 1918-20s. And I'm sure my dad told me that there were brochures that these companies would advertise that come to Kennewick or Richland, that there were water was available, the climate was ideal, and the soil was great, and you could make a living on just a few acres if you knew how to farm. So my dad traveled out here. His name was Francis, and C.F. Fletcher was his. And he bought 20 acres of sagebrush. It was what is now on, what did I say? Spangler Road. He bought 20 acres of there at the top of the hill. It was all sagebrush. And then later he bought 10 acres down below the hill where there now is a trailer park or mobile homes. He had to arrange to get teams of horses to pull out the sagebrush and level the ground. My mother and I believe she had 2 children, and Francine and Mida was my other sister's name, born in 1918. They came out by train from Walla Walla to Kennewick, and Moulton Hess Moulton Hess had a improvised old pickup that Dad said that they met them at the depot in Kennewick, and he brought them out to the farmhouse he'd rented. Before that, my dad had a team of horses, and he brought all his possessions in a wagon from Milton Freewater to Richland. It took him 3 days, he said, to make that trip with the team of horses. And so after he got the house rented, then he sent for my mother, had my mother come out with the children. And they lived in this rented farmhouse about a quarter of a mile away. And there were a few other farms being developed at the same time. So that took a lot of effort. It was 1920, and he told me that he had to put in the irrigation. The company brought water to the edge of your property, and then you had to put in the pipe yourself. There were cement pipes about 3 feet long, 40 pounds, 8 inches in diameter, and he said he put in several hundred feet of this pipe, and he thought he'd done a pretty good job. He'd worked hard, turned the water on, it just leaked all over, so he had to do it all over again. He was pretty persistent. And then they had a hard time the first few years because he was a small person, and a greenhorn. About the only work you could get then was to work for the irrigation company if you wanted to earn some money. And usually that was when the water was shut off, and they had to clean and repair the ditches, open ditches. And he said they wouldn't hire him for a year or two, and because they thought, well, he was a greenhorn, he wouldn't last anyway, and he was kind of small. But he stuck it out, and what happened was they had to put in some new pumps for the irrigation system. And these were larger pumps. They were 3-phase motors, and there wasn't anybody immediately around that knew how to fix them, how to hook them up. excuse me if I get a little emotional. So he told me he told me he thought he could do it. He wasn't too sure. He said he could do it. He told me he could do it. He said he said he wasn't too sure, but anyway, he went ahead with it, and they worked fine. And after that, he said he didn't have any trouble getting a job for the irrigation district. And later on, several years after he got the farm started and everything, he did become manager of the irrigation district. When I talk about the irrigation district, it wasn't a huge one, but there was about 5,000 acres under water. And most of the farms were like ours, 20, 30 acres, and because you had to have a team of horses. You couldn't farm like you can nowadays with mechanized, everything mechanized like it is. Lots of hand labor. So I was born then in 1922, and I believe that they were still in this rented house. But in the meantime, he'd begun work on a basement, which was about half underground and half above ground. It was concrete sidewalls, and so it was above the ground enough that it had fairly good sized windows. And there were just two rooms. The total probably wasn't more than 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. And above that, he put a temporary sort of a shelter. It was more of a tent house with a wooden roof and canvas with a wooden frame with canvas around it. And that was our bedroom. That was where we had our bedrooms. And it was cold in the winter and hot in the summer. But in the summertime, you could roll the canvas up, and the evening breeze would cool it off. In the wintertime, we had feather beds, and my mother would warm up hot irons on the cook stove, and we'd wrap them in towels and put in our beds, and we thought we were living all right. There wasn't any bathroom. There was no indoor bathroom, no indoor water supply. He dug a well down below the hill. Had to do it by hand, about 20 feet deep. And the way to get water up to the house, he had we called it a stone boat. It was a sled. He'd hook the horses to it. The sled, and there were two pretty good sized barrels, I suppose 40-gallon barrels or something. He'd fill them with water from the hand pump down below the hill. And he'd circle around, bring that sled up. That was the water supply for a few days. Well, of course, it didn't always last long enough, and I can remember my mother carrying 2 buckets of water up the hill. It was a hard life for women, especially, carrying water up the hill, and all the other work they had to do. She was in charge of the garden. Of course, we had our weekly bath by a copper tub on a cook stove, and a tub, and that's where we took our weekly bath and shared the fare. So the 2 rooms in the house were the kitchen and where we ate. The other room was sort of the living quarters, and where somebody might sleep if they were not feeling well. Otherwise, we slept upstairs in the tent house. So those were the early days. It took them quite a little while, my dad, to get established, and also get some crops down that they could pay for their living expenses. And they had Fresnos then that the team of horses would pull, and they'd scoop the dirt and dump it in the low places and level it out. And farmers worked together on that. There were, I can remember our neighbors. As I said, most people lived within a quarter or half mile of each other. The Barnetts and Nicholases lived close to us, and we shared when it was time to put in some of the crops. The Barnetts would come with their mowing machine, and there'd be 2 or 3 mowing machines and everything going on, and we'd go back and forth and get the job done. And so
what sorts of crops did you grow then?
It was truck farming. We had to have cows. The truck farming was not too reliable. You had to fall back on. You had a herd of cattle. Most all farmers had a herd of cattle, which they had milk cows and some beef cows. And you milked the cow. You had your own milk then, and made your own cheese. But you could sell to the creamery in Kennewick. And we had a milk house where we'd separate the cream from the milk, and we had the Twin City Dairy, I think it was, would come by once a week and collect the milk. We'd keep the milk in a cool water place or something. I don't remember now the details. We didn't have refrigeration. Maybe they came by twice a week. I'm not sure. So we had a herd of cattle, and of course we always had a team of work horses. And I had a pony when I got old enough, about 3rd grade, I think, in school. I got a pony that had been tamed. He had been one of the wild horses from Horsehaven Hills, and a bunch of horses had been caught. And we bought it from another fellow, and he was a real Shorty was his name, and I thought he was the greatest horse. He could outrun any horse. We had horse races, and a lot of the kids, the only horse they had to ride was a workhorse, so I was very, very fortunate. Anyway, we raised alfalfa for the cattle and the animals, alfalfa and clover, and of course you had to mow the hay in the summertime and let it dry and put it up in wagons and carry it and take it into the haystack for the winter. We also raised some acres of corn, field corn, although we could eat some of the corn when it was quite young, but it was mostly raised for the cattle. And we had an in-ground silo where we had we'd cut when the corn was mature, we'd cut it down with machetes and bring the corn stalks and ears and all and run it through the chopper and made silage out of it. It would ferment in this silo, which was about 20 feet deep, and it was dug out near the barnyard and about, I guess, 12 feet wide or so. I can't remember. As a kid, it looked bigger probably than it actually was, but anyway, that was part of the barnyard, and with the silage and the haystack, we kept the cattle going through the winter, and because you had to have enough hay to get through, and that took quite a little. And then for field crops. We had a cherry orchard of 3 or 4 acres. We raised asparagus, 3 or 4 acres. And that was a job that was a cash crop that came on early in the year in March. And the whole family pitched in. We got up early, almost daybreak, to cut the asparagus before school. You had to have it cut, and then they'd go ahead and you had to pack it in crates to get it ready to market. So we had the asparagus, and then we had between the trees in the orchard. One time my dad experimented with peanuts, and I don't think they turned out too well because I don't remember him having them very long. We had planted strawberries. We had strawberries that we picked after the asparagus was done. The strawberries would get ripe. And then the cherries would get ripe in June usually. And so it was staggered out. And then we always had a field of potatoes that you dig with a team of horses and a digger. But before you did that, you had to get seed potatoes, and they came whole. The family we'd had a cellar in our house. We'd cut those potatoes into quarters so there's an eye on each one, and that would sprout into a potato plant. And we spent probably a couple of weeks, maybe not that long, but cutting the seed potatoes into where they could be planted in the field. And I'm trying to think of other crops that we had. I know he tried different ones. We had peas in a pod, and I don't think that paid off too well because I don't remember it lasted too long. We had some peaches, not a big orchard, but we had some peach and apricot trees. Those were sort of under my mother's domain, the garden and the apricots. And she made sure that we all get pitched in and helped do the weeding and planting and picking, and all of that had to be picked and canned for the winter. I can remember my mother and sisters working hard and doing a lot of work canning. And the cellar was just full of, they were quite proud to display, in those days, to display their glass jars of fruit, peaches and everything, and took it to the fair to see if they could win some blue ribbons. So we didn't buy too much from the local grocery store except cooking oil and bananas, fruit that wouldn't grow here. Orange, those are a treat. Just a few times during the year, bananas and oranges. We got at Christmas time or your birthday or something. And the store was John Dam's. John Dam Plaza's down here, named after the Dam grocery store. And there were two men, John Dam and Victor Nelson. They ran the grocery store. And you didn't go looking for your things. You handed them a list. You wanted 2 gallons of kerosene for your lamps and lanterns that you needed to, no electric lights. And as I said, cooking oil and flour and sugar in bulk. And once in a while you get a treat of candy or something such as that. So I think that covers pretty much what the farm was like.
The crops that you grew, the cherries, strawberries, did you sell those somewhere? And where?
Yeah, we picked and put them in crates. And there was what they called the Big Y. It was in Kennewick, and it stood for Yakima, I think. Yakima, it was a branch of Yakima Produce Company. And later on, I worked there, nailing, making boxes for different kinds of fruit when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. In fact, most kids did get extra jobs like that. Excuse me, I've got to take a drink.
Sure.
Yes. All right.
I was going to ask you about your farm. You mentioned the sort of underground silo. Were there any other buildings on your farm? Any warehouse, barn, or any of that sort of thing?
Yeah, there was a barn for the cows, of course, and there are pictures in my booklet of some of these chicken houses in the yard, a couple of chicken houses, and a milk house. We had pigs. We had the pigs that consumed a lot of the excess milk. They'd eat most anything you had that was extra. And that was another thing when we shared was when it came time to butcher a cow or something, or a calf or a pig for meat. There was a man that was sort of a local veterinarian. I don't think he had a degree. Sam Suplee. If your horse got sick, he knew what or an animal got its foot caught in the barbed wire. He knew how to treat it, and he'd come by. And he also knew how to butcher animals quite well. And he would come out, and I can remember that we had a pit dug out where we could put a fire in there, and it was covered with some kind of bars or metal affair, and a vat of water would be put in that over the fire at ground level. And adjacent to that would be a platform where the pig was killed. And after it had been killed and the organs taken out, they'd roll it into that vat of boiling water, and then pull it back out again after a few minutes. Then you could scrape the bristles off of the pig. And Sam Suplee then would do the rest of the butchering. They'd hang it up to cure overnight, and then they'd cut it up, and for his efforts, he'd get part of the meat, and or other people that had helped out, and that's the way they operated. And he was the local person they turned to. There were other veterinarians in Pasco or Kennewick, but he was the one that they mainly relied on. Our horses, we had two work horses, Star and Monty. I can remember them well, and that was one of my jobs when I got home from school after, was usually to rub them down after a day's work in the field, and because they'd be all sweaty, and or on days when I wasn't at school to in the summertime to take them down to the ditch where they drink a lot of water and they got real hot and sweaty, and then take the harnesses off, and there's lots of preparation before you could do too much. And so those were some of my jobs, was to take in, you got home from school, the first thing to do is take in the firewood for the wood stove or the heating stove, And there are plenty of other things to do, around the barnyard, to clean out the stall, to clean out the barn, and see that horses were fed, and such things as that. The thing was, I think that maybe a little different than nowadays. Kids knew that they were part of the family, and they were an important part of the family, and that they had jobs to do, and it just it was a thing that made families close.
Sure.
We had, I wanted to mention too that we did have special family friends. I mentioned the Barnetts, and they had kids that were, Dan Barnett was about my age, and my sisters had, they had daughters. Anyway, they had kids about our same age. The Hackneys were another family that lived not very far away and had a farm. And there was Richard Hackney, and Dan Barnett and I were always good friends for a long time. And some other kids in that area, Suplees. And so I guess I forgot where I was here on the way that we the Hackneys and the Fletcher families and the Carlsons were particularly close. And the Carlsons also had children that were our ages, and we would get together for family picnics, and especially 4th of July, we'd make our homemade ice cream and take to the Pasco Park where there'd be fireworks. And then in the summertime, we always had a break in the farm work of about 4 or 5 days where we could get away from the farm. Usually it was around the 4th of July or a little bit after. And we would go up, we could get away because the irrigation ditches were shut down for a few days, for about 4 or 5 days, in order for the ditches to dry out and the weeds could be cleaned out, because they'd get clogged up with moss and other stuff, and so that they would dry out the ditches, and we could get away from the farm as long as we had a neighbor to take care of the animals that we had, and there were enough other people that would do that. We'd trade off. So we would manage to get away for about 3 or 4 days and go up to above Yakima, Natchez, and up into the woods. And we'd take our tents. We had one of the Hackneys, Art Hackney, was a school bus driver, and school bus drivers had to have their own buses. They owned their own buses, so he could do with the bus whatever he wanted to in the summertime, and so he would be the one that we would load up the bus. He took a few of the seats out that could be taken out with our camping gear in it, and some of the rest of the people would ride in that bus, and others would go in the car. And we'd invite some of our friends to go along too. So we'd have quite a group and several tents set up there around the lake up at Natchez, Rim Rock, and up in that area. We had a wonderful time up in there with all our friends, and sitting around a campfire at night and hearing the stories that the older folks had to tell. So that's
a real sense of community there.
Yeah, part of the community. It was a close-knit community for sure. Naturally, you had more close friends with some of the people than you did with others, but as I said in my booklet, there was no when you were gone, nobody, as I knew, locked their houses or worried about any of that sort of thing.
You mentioned earlier that the house you lived in, there was no running water, right? And
Right.
no electricity. Did you ever have a telephone or?
That's another little story. My mother, her relatives lived in Wallace, Idaho, and her uncle, aunt and uncle, her uncle was a master carpenter, and they were very close and would come down to visit us, and they were very helpful when my folks were just starting out. They were a backbone to help them out as much as they could. They bought eggs from them and they'd ship them. I have some letters that my mother saved of that period in time. You may be interested in some of those. Anyway, they would come down, and after we had this basement house built, and they was able to save up enough in about 10 years to this Josh Pennebaker was the fellow's was my granduncle's name, was the main carpenter, and they arranged to buy a load of lumber from a lumber yard or a sawmill up in Bickleton, and they rented a truck or got somebody to haul this load of lumber down, and this Josh Pennebaker and my dad, and I think he got some local help to get started on building the house above to replace that tent, actually the tent house that we had above the basement house. And then they enlarged it also. They made it the basement twice as large to accommodate a more modern house. And that's when that was in 1933 or 1934. And I think it was 1934 before we occupied it. And that included an indoor bathroom and running water before my dad was able to build or dig a new well up on top of the hill. He had to go down 60 feet for groundwater, and so that was quite a project. But he finally got it done, and he got a electric motor then. By that time, see, there was no electricity until during Roosevelt. Got the REA started, a rural electricity or whatever the word is, REA. And you got electric pump to pump the water up into a tank, and then you had pressure to run the water from the tank into the house at water pressure. And so we had running water, we had an indoor bathroom, and those were quite appreciated. I think we got electric stove was one of the first things. That was quite an improvement over a wood stove. And you didn't have enough money, I don't believe. Well, let me tell you, go back just a bit.
Sure.
Josh Pennebaker got the house pretty well built, but he had to go back and do his own work back in Wallace, Idaho. And my dad negotiated with a carpenter here, a local carpenter, Vandersant. He was a Dutchman. And my dad traded a milk cow, for this fellow to put in he was a master carpenter too. He put in the kitchen cabinets, is what I'm trying to say, and some of the other cabinets in the bathroom and things like that. in exchange for this cow. Now, there may have been other things involved, but that was the main thing. He told about that in later years, and I could vaguely remember. In addition to the basement, then we had a root cellar where we kept most of our things cold. But anyway, before he could get a refrigerator, he cut a hole in the wall of the kitchen, and he made a cabinet inside, and he hung outside a metal tank or a metal thing that held water, and then he ran down some gunny sack fabric, and that wetted enough to evaporate and cool the cabinet inside. It was quite a contraption, but it worked enough that it probably wasn't much cooler than the basement, but anyway, it was up and it was handy. So that was when we, in 1934, I think, we occupied the house that's there now.
Did you ever have a telephone during the time you lived there?
Yeah, we had a phone. You cranked it. I'm trying to think whether we had it when we lived in the basement, whether we had it there or not. It was a party line, and there'd be 3 or 4 people on the same line, and you answered according to how many rings. If it was 2 rings, it was yours, or a short and a long, or something like that. And of course, people listened in on what was going on, and we had this cranked. It was you cranked it up in order to make the signal, and there was a main station downtown. We were 3 miles from the downtown area up on what is now George Washington Way, and what's the name of that street? Can't remember all those. The one that were my house. The house was on
Spangler.
Spangler, yeah, Spangler Road. Yeah, that was. Yeah, we kept up. Dad kept up with what was available, and.
How about news? Was there a newspaper, or did you have a radio? How did you learn about?
There was the Benton County Advocate came out once a week, and it. In fact, I think I still have some copies of that somewhere. It was mostly local, of course. Somebody was entertaining a company from Wallace, Idaho, or somewhere, and or somebody was sick in the hospital, but that was Ed Petticord was the, as I remember. He was older than myself, but younger than my parents, and he became the first postmaster when the Hanford Project took over, and he was the postmaster for quite a few years before he retired from the Richland Post Office.
I wanted to ask you about the schools that you went to. Where was the school? Any memories?
Okay, they were in the downtown area of Richland. I'm trying to relate it to the grade school was went from grade 1 through grade 8, and it was 2-story with 4 classrooms on the bottom and 4 on the upper level. They were I think they had electric lights, as I remember. The floors were wood floors, and they treated them with oil before school was started and at Christmas vacation. So when you came back from school, they'd wipe them up, of course, the oil, to treat the wood floors. They'd wipe up the oil before classes started, but there'd still be oily spots left on it. And so we had to take our shoes off when we came home at night because we would track oil, have some of that oil on. That was just for a few weeks, or for a week or two. And the stoves had a jacket around. They were, I believe they were coal stoves. They had coal, and there'd be a jacket around, metal jacket around the outside to us, a couple of feet from the stove itself, so the kids couldn't get up and get burned. But the jacket, this jacket that surrounded them was probably 3 or 4 feet high, metal jacket. And I remember hanging our wet gloves and things on that metal jacket to dry them out. And that was in the back of the room, of course. That was your heat in the classroom. As I said, the bathrooms for boys and girls, both they're separate outside, where you went out to the bathroom, and I don't recall any running water or anything in the high school was it wasn't torn down when the project started, our Hanford project, right away, and it was built of more. It had indoor bathrooms. It was more up to date and more than the grade school for four levels. And there's pictures of it in my booklet. And
do you remember?
So that was quite a step up.
Yeah. Do you remember any of the teachers from either school, or have any favorite teachers from that time?
Oh yeah, I remember most of my teachers. My first grade teacher, Ms. Randolph. Older lady, and she was very good. I can remember putting our mittens up around that canopy around the stove, when in the winter time, put your mittens up to dry, and I can't offhand remember. I can visualize most of my teachers. There was Miss Mowry. She was single then. Taught me in fourth grade. And there was Bill Rader, our 8th grade teacher. He was a pretty good disciplinarian. If people got out of line, he had a paddle they didn't mind using. There was I can't think of the names really offhand. And then, of course, in the high school, I remember the more of the teachers that I had. The superintendent he also taught a few classes then, because the grade school had one class of every grade level. I started with in the first grade. I was 5 years old. I became 6 in November. And the kids that I started with, about half of the 20, I think there were 20 in my graduating class, about half of them were the ones I started in first grade with. That's how permanent the group was, that there was not much, there's a lot of permanency. And we went on to this, we moved on to each grade level. You had the same ones. You knew the people. There were 2 or 3 changes each year. Mm-hmm. And like I said, of those 20 or so that started, probably about half of those in my high school class were the ones I started first grade with. And so we knew each other very well. And the others I'd known quite well, too. But my wife, she came later and joined when she was in about 7th or 8th grade, I think. And she graduated 2 years. I graduated in 1940, and she graduated in 1942. And in my graduating class there was 20, and hers there was only 12. I don't know why particularly, but and the high school it was in freshman year you usually took typing, and it was pretty well diversified. History classes, English classes. I can remember the teachers, Mrs. Dighton and Mrs. Carmichael. She's the one that got very emotional with the kids when the kids acted up, and would carry on, and Mr. Carmichael was a superintendent, and Mr. Whitehead rather, and we had basketball teams we played against. Kennewick and Pasco were out of our league. They were from too big a town, so we played Benton City. I played, even though I'm pretty short, I was on the basketball team. We didn't have a football team. We weren't big enough. The high school was only, with four classes, probably only 80 students altogether. And so I was on the basketball team last couple of years anyway. And we would go up to Hanford, was about 20 miles upriver, and White Bluffs. They were a comparative size. They were, and to Benton City, and also to Findlay. We used to call it Riverview then. It was a comparative size to what we were in Richland at that time. So we had a group that we played softball league and basketball. No football that I can remember. We weren't big enough to be in that. So that was.
And did you take the school bus to get to and from school then, or how did you?
Yes. Yeah, we had, as I said, Art Hackney had the school bus that they owned their own school bus. They had a contract with this district, and there's a picture of me, myself and my two sisters in the booklet I gave you, waiting for the bus, and there's a picture of the bus. It was kind of a, it looks kind of obsolete now, but it was that was the way they did things then.
So you graduated high school in 1940.
1940. Right? Then I went off to Cheney for a year and decided I wanted to, didn't want to continue there. I wanted to, I thought I wanted to be an engineer, but I didn't have really the background from the school, and at least I could blame it on that. And so I transferred to Pullman in my sophomore year. And during my beginning of my junior year, I was taken in I was in the ROTC, and we signed up for deferment, or whatever you call it, that they said we could finish out the year we were in during my sophomore year. no, it must have been my junior year. This was the third year, and but it turned out that they couldn't. They took us, drafted us in. I think it was about January of my junior year in Pullman from WSU. And at that time I was a member of Sigma Chi.
So that was that January of 1943 then?
Yeah, it was.
And at some point that year, of course, the federal government started constructing the Hanford site.
Right. I came home before they allowed us when they called up the ROTC fellows in Pullman. They gave us a couple of weeks to come home and see our folks. So I came home, and it must have been the end of January of 1943, and saw my folks and said goodbye to my sweetheart, Betty Mackenzie was her name, became my wife. And after I went back then, I went back to Pullman, and they took us shortly by train from Pullman over to Fort Lewis. And it was an real old train that I mentioned in my booklet. It looked like it was one from the pioneer days. There was well, I don't need to go into all the detail, but there was a coal-burning stove in the end of this railway car for heat, and we went over there on the 1st of February to Fort Lewis. We were not in the Army until they took us over there and swore us in at Fort Lewis. And shortly after that, I got word from my folks that the word had come out that Hanford and White Bluffs and even Richland was all going to be taken over by the government for this Hanford project. And that was in, I believe they got word in late February. And the people up at Hanford, which is, of course, is something where the actual reactors were notified and given about 30 days to evacuate. And my folks, of course, my dad was the manager of the irrigation district at that time, and of the Richland irrigation district. And they had more time because that was where the workers were going to live. But in the meantime, they built Camp Hanford out here where we are sitting about right now, and maybe just a little further north. And you probably have the history of Camp Hanford and all that, so. But anyway, they were allowed to stay in, I think, about 6 months, whereas the others further up where the reactors were being built, they had to get out quick. And so my folks looked around. They bought a place. My dad, by that time, they offered some of the people work. But most of them were farmers, and they wanted to continue farming. And that was my dad. He, by that time, the kids were gone. I was the youngest. The other two, my sisters, were married and off living on their own. So he decided he'd go back to farming, and they offered him a job to see to the some of the irrigation shut the way it was continued. But he decided he didn't want to do that, and a number of people did take jobs here for temporary. And so where was I now?
So your family had 6 months, you said, after they were...
Yeah, about 6 months. They found a place in Kennewick then, and my dad then bought someplace, and he put in a fruit orchard over on what became Blossom Hill in Kennewick.
Okay.
And we took over the old house. When I got out of the Army, I told about that in my booklet here, that we took over their house, a two-story house that was on what's now where Denny's is, on the corner of Kennewick Avenue and the Umatilla Highway.
Do you know how much money your parents were given for their...
They, in those days, and at that time, the government was not as benevolent in their takeover of land, and they did not really offer what the land was worth. So my dad was one of the leaders of the group that took him to court over the offer, and this lingered on for quite a while, because my dad was one of the as a manager of the irrigation district, and John Dam, that the park is named after, and two or three others. They tried to. They figured that they were being offered what the land had sold for in Depression days, which had just been more or less begun to get over in 1943, and my folks and others were beginning to feel established. Here they'd worked most of their working lives for 12, 15 years, getting to where they felt like they were established and could make a good living. And now they were being offered this, where they had to leave relatively quickly, and not being offered enough to buy something comparable in other areas, where they found they had to pay more than what had been offered. So this went to court and drug on for a while. They did get a settlement that my dad was involved in, but it took quite a while, and it still did not, they were not too happy about it, I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, they got over it.
And so you heard about this happening when you were at Fort Lewis, is that?
Yeah, I was still in the service. I was sent from there to Camp Roberts for infantry training, and I was there until June. See, this happened. I was taken in up in February, I guess it was, and we had 13 weeks, almost 4 months, I think it was, of infantry training there in Camp Roberts in the desert in California, and and then I was sent back to New York City. I had an opportunity. Then they took some people to a specialized training program called ASTP, and I was able to get into that because of my college background, and I passed some tests, I guess, and so forth. And so I was back there at the time that and at Camp Roberts in California at the time that all this took place in Richland and their dislocation. And
do you remember what you thought at the time when you found out?
What I thought about all this happening? I mean,
yeah.
Well, so much was happening, you didn't have time to think too much about it. I was because I was involved in the training, and we were kept busy night and day pretty much in the infantry training camp and being back there. But I heard about it. They kept kept me up on it, and there wasn't much you could do about it, and neither could they, because that was it. You could appeal, but that was a long process. The appeal was, and so it just took a time to get over it. They got over it, eventually.
Are there any events or things from your childhood growing up in Richland that sort of stand out, special memories that we haven't talked about yet?
Probably quite a few things. Quite a number of things I've mentioned in this booklet that I've given you. And one thing I particularly remember as a kid was I had this pony, and and my neighbor kids had ponies too, or else workhorses that did the job. And so we could roam around quite a bit. We had a lot of freedom. We all had rifles. We went out hunting, and the jackrabbits were quite numerous. I remember going to just about a mile from where we are now. There's a sand hill over here off of Stevens Drive, which we called Poline Drive those days. There's a sand hill over there. And there was an irrigation ditch that ran along this sand hill, and we'd go over there and the boys take our clothes off, and we'd swim in this irrigation canal. There was a flume there too, and that was kind of an interesting thing to go through. And we would take our rifles, and there was one farm that was close to this sand hill called I'm trying to remember the name now. Anyway, he had a farm. His farm was right adjacent to this to the open sagebrush land and sand hill, and if you were there in the evening, he had an alfalfa field right along the edge of this sort of a desert area. At certain times in the dusk, there'd be a whole bunches of jackrabbits would come in, and I remember we would go there with our rifles, my friends Dan Barnett and Richard Hackney and I, and we'd wait for dusk, and you could shoot these rabbits. And of course, Mr. Sandberg, I think his name, Sandberg was his name. He welcomed anybody that would get rid of the jackrabbits for him because they were destroying his alfalfa field. And so we'd shoot a bunch of jackrabbits, and they did have jackrabbit drives to once in a while, and they had pictures of them, and I might have some in some of my folks' stuff. But anyway, and we had ponies or horses, and we'd go out, and sometimes we'd go up the river from here. Dan Barnett and Richard Hackney and I, as I said, I had a pony that had been caught on the open range, and he could outrun practically any horse around. But we would go up there and we'd camp out for a day, and we would find some old prospectors up there. They'd be panning for gold. And I don't think, from the looks of them, they didn't look like they found very much, but they were interesting characters to tell you stories about their life. And we kind of envied them a little bit, but nobody wanted to do what they were doing. And they would, anyway, then we would go up there and we'd camp overnight. Other times we would go up there. I said that my folks and the Barnetts and the Hackneys we had a boom in the river. We'd catch driftwood coming down for our. Did I tell you about this before? Okay. If I ramble, tell me that. we'd go up. We'd go up. My folks, or my dad, and the other men. We would have wagons. We'd hook the workhorses to the wagons, and we'd take enough food to last a couple of days. And us boys would go along, and some of our boys were old enough to help, and some of us were too young to do much, but to tag along and have a good time. And we'd go up there and we'd set up a camp, and the men would have a log boom up there. They'd attach logs to each other and run them out into the water. And when the water would rise in the spring, it would lift these drift logs from upstream, clear up around where Grand Coulee is now, before Grand Coulee was built, and any other dams. And these drift logs would drift down. If you had a log boom out, you'd catch them as the high water, the high water from the snow melt. And if your log boom was out far enough, you'd get a whole bunch of logs in there, and that would be what you go up. And then we go up and the men would take their team of horses and use their chains to pull these logs out of the water. They'd been caught in a log boom, and then they'd have to cut them up enough to put on their wagons to haul them down home. And this would take 2 or 3 days to do. In the meantime, us kids, the younger ones, we'd have a great time with our shooting rabbits and doing some fishing off the what was left of the log boom, and fixing our hot dogs over the campfire, and it was quite an experience. And we all wanted to go, and I think the girls envied us, they couldn't go. But I don't remember any of the women going. But when they got the wagons loaded, they had them all. I remember they had them sideboards on them, so that they would be loaded up to the maximum. And of course, the roads weren't too good. The horses would be really worn out by the time we got these loads down to where we lived. And we'd have to wash them off, rinse the horses off with a hose, because they'd be all that, and be quite late in the evening before we made it home. So that was quite a big event in our lives, and especially for the young fellows like us, we thought that was great. I'm sure the men folks were glad it was over. So, we had quite a few trips. We went out. I had a friend, Scotty, who lived out in the Yakima River, and I would go over. He was the one that I think I told you about the time that, maybe it is in my booklet, about the time that our well, the well that we dug up on the top of the hill, the 60-foot well, it had been real cold that winter, and usually the well didn't freeze, but it froze that winter. And so Scotty, my friend, he was the adventurer, more so than I was. He said, I can go take a blowtorch down there and thaw that out. Well, he did. I don't know why my dad let him down this well. The well was hand dug, and it was only about so big around. And there were iron steps put in the cement, as they went down. They did that. As I said, it was 60 feet deep. Of course, the water stood up in it about 20 feet. Or so, it would fluctuate. So Scotty went down with a blowtorch and to thaw this pipe out, because it had frozen the pump. And he got down there, and I guess the confines of the gas or something exploded. And he was lucky he wasn't killed. He was he was somehow it went upward rather than downward, and he was able to get out, but his face was black and his eyebrows were singed off, and he was quite a mess from that occasion. But he wasn't. He didn't have to be hospitalized. They put cream on his face, and I don't remember whether they got the pipe thawed out or not. I don't think so. I think it took a few days before it got the water up.
So, if someone was to ask you what it was like to grow up in a community like Richland, how would you respond to that? What would you say?
It was an interesting place to grow up because you were involved in all the activities. You were important as a member of the family. You had chores to do. You also had interesting experiences. You had time to play with your neighbors and develop your own activities and sports to a great extent. I guess probably I look back on it more with rose-colored glasses than it actually was, but because I'm sure it was harder for the adults because it was kind of touch and go for them many times. There was no WPA or relief organizations. People helped their neighbors out when they needed it. I can remember a family that lived not too far from us that the husband died, and they had some fairly young children, the Frasers, and the wife was left with these young, I forget how young they were, 2 or 3 youngsters, and a small farm. And the people of the community just helped out. There was no other organization that they knew of. And later, Bruce Fraser, who was in that family, who was about my age, he wasn't a classmate, but he told me years later, the reunions we used to have, he said, "Did you know?" Did you know how much help your mom and dad gave? I'm sorry.
Right.
How much help your mom and dad gave my folks. And, I said I had no idea. He told me that my dad and mother and others, now he said it wasn't just them, but they're the ones that made it possible for them to survive. I hadn't known this. They didn't talk about it, you know. So excuse me. Let's cut it off a minute. Where are you? Wipe my eyes here. I'm glad to get this opportunity. Don't take me wrong.
That's all right.
I'm glad to get the opportunity to talk to you know.
That's all right.
There's not too many people want to listen to it. Have a little drink.
Sure. think we're just about finished anyway. I think we've covered a lot of the things that I wanted to cover.
All right.
So I guess, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important to talk about, or?
I can't. I think we've covered everything pretty well. I've probably gone sidetracked a lot, and it was a well-knit community. As I said, that they did help each other out in many ways, and yet they're very independent too. There aren't too many of us left. We still have a reunion. We did. It's getting down to where there aren't very many of us left, but last year we met at the Old Country Buffet and had a good time. I think that there may have been about 20 of us, but about half of them were descendants, children that brought their parents who needed help to get there, and.
So it's a reunion of people from Richland?
That had the old-time Richland, that lived in old-time Richland. There's another, there's the Duranlos, Ray Duranlo, that he was quite a storyteller. He still lives here, and he was just a year or two younger than myself. And Alice Perkins is his wife, Alice Perkins Duranlo. And I kind of think he'd be in the phone book, if not. And Price Colley, George Colley, his name was, but there's a Colley family that he was here last year, and he's quite a storyteller.
What time of year do you usually get together?
Let me think now. Usually in the middle of September, middle to late September. Edith, I used to be the one that was in charge of getting the literature out and the reunions set up. And but now anyway, Edith Weedle Hansen, Hansen, is the one that is doing it now. She was in my wife's class 2 or 3 years behind me in graduating from high school. And she's still here, and I could maybe give you some more information on that later if you want to call me. I don't know if you had trouble.
I would just want to thank you very much for coming in today and being willing to
I enjoyed it.
have me ask you questions.
Okay, I hope that some of it's good use.
Very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you very much.